Hi, everyone. Greetings to all my friends out there in Portugal and all my other friends over around the world that experience Agile. Thanks for tuning in. Today, we're going to talk about how to form and run a good executive action team. Let's get started. So first of all, you should all know where I come from, and that is Scrum.inc. Everyone should know the gentleman on the top left of your screen, Dr. Sutherland, who's the co-creator of Scrum, and put it down in the Scrum guide. His son, J.J. Sutherland, to his right, is our current CEO and the author of the Scrum Field Book, our second book with all the stories. Take a look at chapter 4, yours truly, that came out since the printing of our first book, the Red Book. Scrum they are doing twice the work in half the time. And this is where most people are familiar with Scrum because of the stories around software. And most of the stories in there are around software. But since that time, we've got a lot of case studies that came out in the Yellow Book and beyond from automotive and avionics, consumer packaged goods and process development, which are places where I spend most of my time. That's me over there on the right-hand side. I'm one of the contributing authors and editors of the Scrum at Scale guide. And some of you might be wondering, well, why are there two guides? So for those who aren't familiar, the Scrum guide deals with Scrum from a single team perspective. Once you start adding a lot of teams, and I don't mean 2 or 4, I mean 10, 20, 100, 1,000 teams, you need a little bit more stuff to make sure it all works well. And that's all codified in the Scrum at Scale guide. I spend most of my time in the Fortune 200 now, mainly working with leadership around architecting agile transformations and trying to help them understand what is their role in supporting agile transformations. If you want to hear any other crazy stories about stuff like this, please write me separately. It's fun topics to talk about. But today, let's get started on our goal, which is how to assemble an executive action team that is functional and can run very, very constructively. And there's a couple of pieces to get this right. So my base assumptions going into this are that you have read the Scrum at Scale guide and you understand what agile architecture, agile organizational architecture looks like, not product perspective so much, but also how you would construct an organization. If you're unfamiliar with any of the things that I'm talking about as we go through this and you'd like further reference, please go download the Scrum at Scale guide from Scrum.inc. It's available in a bunch of different languages in case English isn't your primary one. So let's begin where all Agile people love to start. We always have this phrase in Agile land, right? Start with why. Why do we need any is a great question. And in order to answer that, what we really want to focus on is why are organizations struggling to be Agile at all? One of them is that they can't prioritize. They just can't figure out what should be first, what should be second. They don't have a good evidence-based method of figuring that out. The second one is that they actually just can't deliver. Now, what that means in each organization is different. Some can't deliver on time, some can't deliver as promised, but this is a big reason why organizations struggle to be Agile. The third one is that they can't regularly refactor the organization to meet whatever market demands or priorities there might be. So that's a third major reason. And the fourth one is that their company culture is actually directly at odds with agility. And let me be clear here about company culture, because this isn't a lecture on culture, but I do want everybody to understand that culture is not what you tell people it is, what you legislate, or pretty fancy, posters you hang around the office with buzzwords. That's not culture. Culture is what happens in between the meetings. That's where culture tends to exist. It's not, what we say, it's what we do. So this is one of the things that really makes organizations struggle to be Agile. And if you cannot challenge the approach to the way these things are being done at your company, Agile might just not be for you. And that's okay. There are other ways to run organizations, and many of them are valid, but to be Agile, you have to be able to constantly challenge and iterate and incrementally improve all of these 4 things. So who's supposed to do this is a great question. Well, when it comes to prioritization, that's actually the executive meta scrum. So this is the groupings of product owners and chief product owners and other leaders that are dedicated to those functions getting together. It's the rest of this stuff that's actually handled by the executive action team. And that's great because that's what we're here to talk about today. So Scrum at Scale is a meta framework beyond Scrum as a framework that contains 12 what we call components. Some people will call them nodes out here. And if you notice, they're broken into two cycles. One of them is the product owner cycle, which is run by the executive meta Scrum. And this is on the right-hand side. This is all about the what the teams are going to deliver. We're going to spend our time talking about the other side of the diagram, which is the Scrum Master cycle, which is revolves around the hub of that is the executive action team, which is all about the how things are getting done and how things are getting out to our customers. Now, both of these executive bodies, if you notice the overlap, need metrics and transparency, but they need different metrics. And so that's an important distinguishment between the two. Both of them are a touch at the team process because every team needs a product owner and a Scrum Master. And they also both touch at feedback. But the product owner cycle, the executive meta Scrum side is looking at product feedback, whereas the executive action team and the rest of the Scrum Master cycle is looking at release feedback. So there's a little separation there. In Scrum at Scale, just like Scrum, we're always trying to separate out the accountability of what and how, so that the clear accountabilities make for better and smoother coordination, especially at scale. So what does an EAT do? What does an EAT do? The executive action team has very, very specific goals. The first one is to align the organization along a shared and transparent transformation strategy. So how we're going from wherever we are to wherever we're going to be. They want to make sure that transformation strategy has a backlog that's prioritized in order to execute against the vision that strategy is supposed to achieve. Second, they're supposed to continuously observe the metrics that are tracking product delivery throughput while removing any impediments that are inhibiting delivery at a sustainable pace. Third, they have to enable the execution of the high-level transformation processes with a primary focus on removing waste, which means the folks who do this have to understand lean. And if you know much about Scrum's history, we come from lean. And so you really have to understand what is value stream mapping look like, and value stream analysis, single piece continuous flow, and these kinds of concepts, because that's where we really analyze where the waste is and we have the ability to extract it. Lastly, we want to support the product owner and Scrum Master cycles through mentoring, coaching, and challenging the organization to evolve both incrementally and iteratively over time. Now, in order to do this, there's a whole host of inputs and outputs that have to happen. I'm not going to read all of these. You can take a look at them, but they need a lot of data, and they need also a lot of visibility and transparency into what's going on into the organization. That's a real key part of them being able to function effectively. Now, when it comes to these major accountabilities, removing impediments, accountable for Scrum and improving the quality of it, owning the transformation strategy and executing it, or delegating it to the Agile practice, total other topic, but a lot of places have a center of excellence because the executives who run the EAT don't have the ability to go out and do it themselves. And owning that transformation backlog. When you take a look at those accountabilities, there are three major groupings. The first one is all about impediments. That's one major grouping. The second one is all about the Scrum itself, the quality and business agility that they have. And the third one is that transformation strategy and executing it. So we're gonna look at the executive action team through the lens of these three major accountability categories. So how do you choose your members? This is a great question. And I would go back and say, think about the accountabilities. You need people who are going to understand those accountabilities and be like supercharged to go handle them. That's who you want on your EAT. Now, when we talk about what a sample scaled structure looks like, and this is now put into like a matrix organization. I use a lot of those flower diagrams where the teams are all spread out nicely, and I like those because Scrum at Scale is not hierarchical, but a lot of folks have some trouble following them. So I've made this as an alternative. Now, when you look at this diagram, and again, my apologies, I'm using a two-dimensional representation. So it looks hierarchical, but it's really not. Try to think of it as more three-dimensional, or everybody on the same playing field. Now here, what you have is the first layer, the product owner layer, that's really dedicated to making awesome products. And that's where all your product owners exist and your executive meta scrum exists. On the bottom of this diagram, we have the second layer, which is the Scrum Master layer, that's all about making an awesome process. In the middle, that middle layer is where all the work is getting done. But we also have this third grouping, awesome people, the function owners. Now, when I normally start setting up a transformation, what I'll do with the executives is I'll have them understand this diagram and go through an exercise where we understand that everybody in leadership cares about all three things. They care about awesome products and awesome process and having awesome people. But the truth is, you might care about them all, but you've got to pick one. You got to focus on one if you want to get anywhere. So I have the leaders kind of self-select into these three things, because whoever cares the most about awesome process, they're going to end up in the Scrum Master side of the organization. And those are the folks that you want on your team. It's really best to self-select rather than kind of volunteer people where they should go. So who are good candidates for the executive action team? This is a great question that we always get. The first one I would say is you need to have a leader who can change company policy without having to ask permission. Commonly, that's the CIO, the COO, or the CTO, not the CEO. You're going to find them on the executive meta scrum, but because they're not really concerned all the time with the day-to-day, depending upon the size of the organization. I mean, if you got a company with 10 people, yeah, the CEO cares about day-to-day. But in most of the large organizations where you and I might find ourselves, this is where the COO is like chief of operations. Hey, that's a day-to-day kind of activity. You need to have someone who can write a check. And there's a specific reason why. It's because a lot of impediments can go away with just a signature. Now, again, not the CFO. The CFO is also probably going to be on the EMS, but we need somebody else like a VP or senior vice president of finance who has a good amount of budget. Then we need someone who's a Scrum star, someone like all of you who are watching this video right now, an agile champion, someone who can really help remind the executives what it means to be agile. And when they're trying to do things that would be contrary to Scrum or the agile values and laid out in the manifesto, or principles for that matter. We often have to remind people who are not immersed in this, hey, by the way, that's contrary. And I don't mean somebody who's obnoxious about it, like, hey, that's not Scrum. I mean somebody who can really help them understand that if they put a policy in place that is contrary to the agile values or principles or the Scrum values, that hey, there might be a better way to do this that is in line with them rather than opposing them. I would also recommend a leader who can motivate change. Now, that doesn't have to be an outside fourth person to the three that I've mentioned here. It could be one of those is also an amazing motivator inside the company. But in case those three are not, it's good to have this as an additional person. You also probably need somebody from people operations, and that's what commonly we say in Agile land is human resources. And I don't like to use that term because I don't like to think of people as resources. People are people, and it's okay to call them that. So why do we need someone from people ops? Is that often the biggest impediment is that we don't have the right talent in the organization. We need to hire. And unfortunately, sometimes the impediment is we have the wrong talent and we need to shed someone. And the laws around hiring and firing vary from state to state or municipality to municipality or county to county or even country to country. And so in order to figure that out, we really need someone from people operations on the team. Lastly, you may need someone else of a different specialty based on context. So if you're in a banking company, having someone from security and compliance is going to be essential on your executive action team. If you're in the consumer packaged goods and you produce an alcoholic beverage, or you produce foodstuffs that have components that have to regularly be reviewed by things like the government organizations like the FDA, you'll need somebody who's an FDA expert or someone from legal on that. If you're manufacturing hardware, you may need someone from production or manufacturing, or even service on that executive action team, because those may be the biggest impediments that you face. So when you're thinking about this, you're thinking about the people you need to get work done and get done work to your customers. That's how you would staff your executive action team. And when we do this in class, by the way, whether it's a regular Scrum at Scale class, a public class, or we're doing it in a leadership workshop inside of an organization, I'm usually using something like this just as a template, and feel free to take this from the slide deck when you get it. This is a great thing to put down in an exercise, and you can see I usually give them about 2.5 minutes to kind of figure out who are there, who they think should be in all these slots. And then we have everybody compare and kind of figure out, who does everybody agree would be good candidates for this executive action team. Now, how do you run an effective executive action team? That's the second goal that we wanted to achieve. So again, thinking about the accountabilities, let's look at it from that lens. When it comes to the strategic part of this and executing that strategy and owning that backlog, well, that's kind of simple. You have to make one. So first thing you want to remember is taking somebody else's might not work for you. And that's because every company context, culture, and environment is different. So there's no one size fits all solution. That's a really important thing to recognize before you start. There are lots of different tools out there, and you're going to try to, find ones that address the dysfunctions in your system so that you can optimize it. Once you identify those, then you can scale, provided that you don't constrain the expansion or the scaling of the different teams in a preconceived way. Let it happen a little bit more organically. See what's needed. That's that third mega issue about organizational refactoring. Don't think, oh, well, we have to expand this when the market's telling us, no, it would be this product that's doing better and we need more teams over here. The goal is this type of organic growth at a sustainable pace. Now, we commonly talk about sustainable pace in the Agile Manifesto in terms of how much work a team can do and how much product customers can digest. But I want you to think about sustainable pace of the organization. And that includes the folks doing this and involved in the change. Because if you try to push too hard, it's odd because we're dealing with human psychology, but it operates by Newtonian physics. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. If you try to push change too hard, it pushes back on you. The people push back on you. So you have to, it's really an art. You got to figure out what's the sustainable pace of change for the folks in your organization. Try to remember that changing to agile ways of working is not about best practices that work elsewhere. It's about best principles. What works in some place, like even if you're in a financial institution, what worked over at ING Bank might not work by you. What worked over at Bosch, if you're in manufacturing, might not work by you. What worked over at Dell, if you're in software, might not work by you. So try to figure out what's the best principles and then apply that and figure out your own best or leading practices. I prefer leading practices because once we say best, it means it can't get any better. So figure out the leading practices that you need to work for you. Now, when you're doing this vision, I'm putting two examples here. You can use this one, a lean change canvas, or the one that myself and one of my coworkers pioneered over at Scrum.inc. We use a visioning board. And these can be simple, or they can even be more complex, like including things like OKRs and timelines and stuff that you want to generate. But whatever you do, however you choose to run this, figure out the vision and then start breaking it down into smaller pieces. Because what you need to make is a backlog. So this is like a sample backlog for an email client, but you should be able to do this for your transformation, where you have big pieces, prioritized from left to right, and then smaller pieces prioritized from top to bottom, and even broken down into releases by sprint or by a couple of a quarter, however you want to run it. But you need to make a story map for your transformation, and that's the executive action team's job. So we've got the strategy part down and the execution part down. Now let's talk about the accountability part. So in order to be accountable for the quality of Scrum, measuring it and figuring out how to improve it, you have to actually take the data. And that means doing some kind of agile maturity surveys and stuff. Now, how you choose to do that, again, varies from place to place, company to company. Here's an example of what Spotify did, everybody's darling of the agile world back in the day, even though I think most of us know that they're not doing this anymore. But when they did do it, they did stuff like this really, really well. And take a look here. They have like the condition And is it improving? Is it getting worse? Is it staying the same? And the idea again with this kind of a dashboard, just to be clear, it's not for praise or punishment. It's to target where coaching goes. In Agile land, for those of you that are not familiar, we don't take data like this or looking at teams' velocities and throughputs and stuff like that for the purpose of coming down on them if they're not meeting certain expectations, but for highlighting where coaching should go. And that's a really important function of the executive action team, is to help figure out the coaching part of the organization through the scrums of scrums and scrum masters or agile coaches in the organization, how to target those teams that are not doing as well and get them to a better state. Let's take a look at our last accountability, which is all about removing impediments. So the way we do this is at the executive action team holds a scaled daily scrum. So each team holds a daily scrum. They may go to a scrum of scrums, scaled daily scrum with an aggregation of teams, but eventually the impediments that cannot get resolved by the teams themselves due to things like scope or finance required, amount of money to get rid of it, or political power in the organization, those are going to end up at the executive action team. And ideally, the executive action team is going to meet once a day, just like the teams, because it should be running like a scrum team, but at the very minimum, once per sprint. And it should mirror the daily scrum in that it's 15 minutes or less if possible, but often the EAT daily scrum runs longer because of the complexity of topics and trying to figure out, hey, who's going to tackle this impediment? That's a really big deal. Now, when it comes to these impediments, one of the most common things that happens in the beginning of transformation is that every impediment shows up at the EAT. And that's not functional, because the idea behind doing Scrum and Scrum at scale is to have empowered teams. And that means the teams need to be empowered to get rid of impediments too. And sometimes you have to kind of encourage them to take that power. So one of the ways we do that is with an impediment template like this. Take a look at this. If they're bringing an impediment to you, they have to be able to tell you what they're trying to accomplish, what's stopping them from doing it, and the impact of not being able to do it. Now that's easy. Everybody knows those parts, right? But here's the secret. Questions 4 and 5. What have you tried already? Because if the teams can come to you and say, well, we haven't tried anything because this is for you to do, it's okay to kick it back to them and say, hold on. In order to be an empowered, self-managing team, you have to try too, and you have to try first. When they do that, it helps, because then they can come to you and say, hey, we thought of this, this, and this, and it didn't work. Now the executives can take that and say, oh, well, we're not going to replicate that. We're going to figure out what's next. And in order for them to understand that, question number 5, what's your vision of an ideal resolution? What do you want it to look like when this is gone? That helps the executives understand, okay, so they tried these 3 things, it didn't work. This is the beautiful outcome they would like. Let's make that happen for them. That makes it much easier for them to craft what their solutions might be. Here's an example from real life. This is written in Jira for those of us who are somewhat forced into using it, but just so you see it, you can actually add in the description those exact questions, and people will fill it out, and then they can literally submit it electronically. And back in the old days, we used to put this on a board outside the room where the executive action team used to meet. And that was really good. And I like that the best, because then you can say, where is it in doing, and done, or how long it's been and how long it's been there. We also used to tag a specific executive action team member's name to each impediment, so that when someone was curious about, hey, where's this at? Why isn't it done? Like, what's going on? They would know the exact person to go talk to, instead of talking to every member of the EAT before trying to figure it out. So it was really helpful. And I'm sure you can do the same thing electronically. It's totally possible now. So that's all we're going to talk about today. I hope this was helpful. If you've got questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Find me on LinkedIn, find me on Twitter, send me an email, and let's have a conversation. I hope you're going to have a great time at the rest of the conference. And I know there's going to be a Q&A after. I might be able to attend. If not, it'll probably be one of my good friends out there, hopefully in Portugal. And I hope everyone has a great time and good scrumming. Take care, everybody.